In the world of movies, the sequel is very rarely an improvement on the original, but in the realms of games, a sequel is usually able to build upon the graphics, controls and mechanics of its predecessor to give us an overall better rounded product. So what follows is my personal list of the top 5 most disappointing game sequels. They may not be awful games by their own merits, but for one reason or more, these games sadly let me down upon their release. In the lead up to a new console's release, Square Enix's Final Fantasy games are a property gamers look to as a showcase of what the new generation of consoles' power can bring to us. And whilst Final Fantasy XIII was a tour de force from a graphical perspective, it let me down in nearly every other facet. The game lacks any of the qualities that makes Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. A complete lack of villages to explore, barely any NPCs to interact with, and a frustratingly linear experience that doesn't open up until hours into the game. An absolutely impenetrable plot and unlikable characters caps off a truly frustrating experience, and whilst the game does get better as it goes on, saying to someone it gets good after 12 hours is a bit of a hard sell. In retrospect, Resident Evil 5 was where things started to go downhill with the series, but it was actually received fairly well when it launched. But Resi 6 completely lost the plot, and not only had no idea what made a good Resident Evil game, but no idea what makes a good game full stop. Abandoning the series' survival horror roots almost entirely, Resi 6 has 3 campaigns with 3 very distinct styles of play, none of which are any fun. By trying to do so much, Resi 6 fails to excel at any of them. The game has a frustratingly unreliable cover system, a god-awful script even by Resi standards, and not remotely frightening, even to a scaredy cat like me. Thank goodness for Resident Evil 7. The first Hotline Miami was one of my favourite games of its generation, a top-down shooter that played like a cross between Smash TV and Dark Souls, with an emphasis on making up tactics on the fly and being punished instantly for any lapse in judgment or lack of concentration. On the surface, the sequel appears to be the same, a hyper-violent shooter with an 80s aesthetic and an absolutely phenomenal soundtrack, but much like Resident Evil 5 and 6, it seems to have a distorted perspective on what made the original so good. The sequel is far more linear in its approach, expecting you to take a specific route through a level, and the decision to use wide open spaces leads to some terribly unfair deaths as enemies kill you from off screen. It's discouraging, disheartening, and despite adoring the original, I just couldn't bring myself to finish this one. Okay, I need to preface this by stating very clearly that I love this game. I do. I think the New Game Plus is the best in the series. I love the bonfire aesthetics as a means to change up the difficulty on the fly. Some areas and enemy designs, taken on their own merits, are very decent, and the DLC areas are uniformly excellent. The only reason this game was a disappointment to me is because it's the sequel to Dark Souls, one of my favourite games of all time. And with that being said, there's some creative choices in this that not only make it a disappointment, but in my opinion, make it the weakest entry in the Soulsborne franchise. The warping between bonfires and lack of cohesion between levels is a major step down from the unified worlds of the first game. The brighter tone loses some of the oppressive atmosphere, and the god-awful enemy placement and sheer numbers of enemies feels cheap and unsatisfying. The bosses are largely unimaginative, and honestly, the whole thing feels like a watered down version of Dark Souls. BioWare's hugely successful and beloved trilogy of Mass Effect games was a masterclass in writing endearing characters wrapped in a gripping sci-fi world, worthy enough to be spoken of in the same conversations as the greatest sci-fi films and shows of all time. So how did they manage to balls up the sequel so much? I'm going to keep this short because, understandably, talking about my most disappointing game of all time is bloody upsetting. So poor animation and unforgivable amount of glitches and bugs aside, the script is nearly always poor. From a developer well known for their storytelling, especially in a sci-fi setting, the plot hardly ever makes any sense, and the characters are... I can't even remember any of the characters. The game's barren planets are boring to explore and riddled with dull quests, and I'm going to stop here because I'm getting annoyed thinking about it. I'm not just disappointed in this game, I'm angry at it because it may well have killed off one of my favourite franchises. So which sequels didn't live up to your expectations set up by the first? Or maybe you'd like to tell me why I'm wrong about the games on this list. Either way, get down into those comments and make your voices heard. A big thank you to YouTuber ScouseMouse for letting me use his Dark Souls 2 footage. Despite what I said, it is still a really good game, and he's currently doing a thoroughly entertaining playthrough of it, so do go check that out. If you do like what I'm doing here, give me a cheeky subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Ta-ra.